The US military failed on COVID. It was very observable. It was a huge billions of dollars. They were defeated. They were defeated like with the aircraft carrier and so on. And so that made me realize that actually you cannot take the US military at their word on anything. I have to probe on, poke on that, just as we have to do on every other aspect of the government. And that actually, I said, months and months and months before the very public defeat in Afghanistan. You can see, like on the Ferris podcast, I talked about this. Okay. And people poke back on me and they're like, Balaji, I don't think that's right. You're overstating it. Because the reason is it's not exactly totally out of scope, but it's not totally within scope. It's like a borderline thing where people don't usually think about biowarfare as their core competency. When you point it out, it is, but it's just not something that they had that frame or narrative on, right?
Right.
Okay. So because of that, it wasn't like set up. It's kind of like saying Instagram defeated Kodak. Well, yeah, but they came at it from right angles. They weren't like a film company. They were coming at it as a digital camera company, effectively, or a camera app company. So, but with Afghanistan, it was much more clear. Okay.
Yeah.
6 months later, you have this catastrophic withdrawal. Now, this is a complicated issue, which you can argue, I think, several points at the same time, right? First, you can argue that like even Ron Paul voted to authorize military force to go after Al-Qaeda. I think that's legitimate. I also remember the mood in the country at that time. And the problem is, as like, 20 something, or in your case, you're, in very early 20s, it's 2021, you were in your teens or whatever. You don't have the intelligence of the CIA. And so like all that stuff, you're basically going to trust that the government kind of knows what it's doing with this kind of thing. We didn't have social media. We didn't have other forms of information that were better, at least at first, Mm-hmm. And so, like when you're not paying that later, of course, there are anti-war protests and so on. But as civilian, you really don't have any way to gainsay what military intelligence is saying. You're like, you know what? These guys have billions of dollars per year. The entire country's united. Throw my trust behind them, right. Go and kill the bad guys, right? We don't want more stuff to blow up, because the anthrax scare also happened a few weeks later. So that authorization of military force, I think, was legitimate. Then, of course, that became, the occupation, and then Iraq, and trying to transform it. I actually don't know if there's any options that were good. With hindsight, you can say, yeah, just do spec ops, and just go and liquidate those guys and pop out. But that's you could also say some people called for like shutdown of immigration, for example, right? Which lockdown is kind of done. And I think that's actually going to happen more in Europe than in the US. Mm-hmm. And so there were alternate paths that could have been taken, but and I think, like had the immigration shutdown, for example, just to talk about that for a second, had that been a total moratorium as opposed to like singling out one group, I think people would have grumbled, but I think they would have been okay with it. That could have been a different direction that was taken. Mm-hmm. And, and then you basically would just go and do spec ops, and you would be, you'd basically like look at visas from Saudis and so on. I mean, one of the issues was there's a quarter under the lamppost aspect of things where, the quarter under the lamppost, you lost your quarter over here, but you're looking under the lamppost, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
What seems to have been, known at that time, and certainly today, is that all those guys were like Saudis, I believe, or many of them were Saudis, the ones at least who were reported as the hijackers. And yet Saudi Arabia really wasn't mentioned in any of this because they were an ally. And there was something that was recently declassified about like Saudi Arabian involvement into hijackings or something like that. Okay. So you can look at that. So it was whatever. This has all been litigated, for many, many years before the present day. Point being, you can argue as to why we got in there, what should have been done. In terms of the withdrawal itself, though, here's the thing that was problematic was, saying amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics.
Yes, you brought that up. That's a good one. Yeah.
Okay. So that's not my coinage. That's like a famous, military saying, right? Because it's not so much, which tank's gun is going to win against another tank's gun. That's important. But a more important question is, how are you going to fuel the tanks? And how about the, food for the soldiers? And are they going to be able to get over this terrain? And, blah, blah, blah. Like,
all the administrative spreadsheet boring stuff is what actually matters.
Wins wars, right? Yeah. And this withdrawal showed that the U.S. military now sucks at logistics. because they were spotted $2 trillion and 20 years and total air superiority and total surveillance of all communications and a government they had handpicked and a military that they had stood up and like basically an ersatz civil society. Ersatz meaning it wasn't like real, but they had stood it up. Like all this NGO industrial complex, which by the way is right alongside the military industrial complex. It's like the priests who come in alongside the warriors when you occupy territory. And even though they pretend to not like each other, they're really mutually enabling because these guys justify the human rights, blah, 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 that says, invade you for democracy.
This is good cop, bad cop at scale.
Exactly. It's the left hand washing the right. And, the best way of even seeing that was that poster that was on the wall. Did you remember that? The one that the Taliban fighter was standing in front of the gun?
Slogans on the wall mean nothing to the guys with the guns. What are the slogans?
So on the wall, you have all of this,
bullshit.
UN Sustainable Development Goals, gender equality, et cetera.
Yeah.
And in front, I feel bad for these people.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I do feel bad for these people. They're being herded by a Taliban fighter with an AK.
Yeah.
The slogans on the wall. The thing about this is almost like a Renaissance painting, right? Because it shows something that is not normally, that's usually denied or not thought about, which is the NGO industrial complex is backed by military force.
Of course.
All of those slogans on the wall mean nothing if you do not have the superior military force in that jurisdiction.
To impose it. Yeah.
To impose
Absolutely.
it. And it shows also that can be defeated.
Mm-hmm.